Hi again. Thought we'd have a little conversation about time today. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to have superhero abilities here or manipulate reality the way Neo can in The Matrix. Although, manipulating reality may not be far off the mark, because although you may not realise it, we all have the ability to slow down time by disrupting our normal psychological processes, which I'll explain more about in a minute. In fact, you've probably had this happen yourself, perhaps without realising it. A common experience of this is maybe waiting in a queue. For example, if you're stuck in traffic without any form of entertainment, wishing and waiting to get where you need to be and wondering why the time seems to be dragging so slowly. But it can also happen whilst actually enjoying yourself, like when you travel to a new country and explore a new city for the first time. I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment too. First, I just wanted to point out that although slowing down time, or at least your perception of time, may seem like fantasy or sci-fi to someone who doesn't recall ever experiencing it, it's not some make-believe concept. There's documented reports and evidence for this. For example, in moments of emergency, when a person needs to think and act quickly, their focus becomes super concentrated. Or during an intense meditation session. There's tons of evidence that show during these events there can often be a time dilation. So what's actually happening here and why does it happen? Well, as you can imagine, your brain is doing 1,000 things at once, and part of its job is to process time. But time isn't something that exists in a rigid linear way. Time is subjective. It's kind of like a little illusion that we've all agreed on as a society, but our individual temporal perception of time is rooted in the way our brain processes sensory information. So if someone is experiencing something intense, like a rush of adrenaline or being hyper-focused or being in a completely unfamiliar environment, your brain suddenly has to deal with an overload of information and may decide to slow down its processing of time. And there's also the release of dopamine. Like if you're doing something new that's exciting and unusual, the dopamine makes time feel like it's stretching out. Or if you've ever had that feeling of being engaged in a thrilling experience and it feels like hours have passed when in fact it's only been minutes, that's dopamine. Especially if it's been induced through drugs like cannabis. Any stoner will tell you that time seems to move at half speed when you're high. So as you can see, all of these outside factors can mess with our perception of time. But get this, the brain's default mode network, the part of the brain responsible for self-reflection and our sense of self, always plays a role in this time-warping experience. So basically, when this network gets quiet, say during a meditation session or during intense focus, our usual sense of time collapses. Without that constant me chatter going on in the background of our mind, we're free to experience time differently. It's almost like the brain goes, forget the clock, just experience the moment. And don't get me started on psychedelics. Psilocybin, LSD, DMT, all of these substances will mess with the brain's normal function. They disrupt the default mode network in a massive way, which is why people can have these profound time dilation experiences. Time in those moments loses its grip on you. You're no longer counting seconds, you're basically swimming in a sea of the eternal now. But for me personally, it's always been most noticeable during those visits to a new country or city, especially if it's drastically different from the norm. Those days where you're wandering the streets of a city that's unlike anywhere you've ever been before can feel like that day is twice as long, and I love that. It's one of the main reasons I wanted to talk about this today, because you see, for most people, the older they get, the more they settle into a routine, and the more the brain gets efficient. This is what speeds everything up. That's why for many people watching this, the weeks just seem to fly by. Now remember, on average, we get only 4,000 weeks in a lifetime. Do you really want to let them slip away while living a familiar life? Your brain is running like a well-oiled machine, and that machine is ticking by so fast you can't even hear it. You look back and a decade's gone by. This is why I think it's really important to break out of those patterns. You've got to shake up your routines for your own mental sanity and your relationship with time. The more you let time become just another wheel on the hamster wheel of your life, the faster it's going to go by. Do you really want that? Well, if like me, you don't want to let your life go by in the blink of an eye, you need to create new flows in your life where you're putting yourself in situations where you're not just following the same repetitive patterns. where you're trying new things, going to new places, meeting new people, reading new books, meditating. Whatever it is, you need to make your life a little less predictable. It's all about stimulating the brain, keeping it engaged, keeping it from falling into that efficient yet slippery time-sucking autopilot. In the end, mate, time is this weird thing that we can't control, and yet somehow we're completely responsible for how we experience it. Time doesn't just fly by because we're getting older, it flies by because we're repeating the same thing over and over without injecting any novelty into the mix. So my advice? Take a step back, look at your life and ask yourself, am I just living on a loop, or am I truly experiencing every single moment?